My name's Jan McVarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. If you haven't heard about us already, then come and talk to me and my colleagues on our stall, which is outside of the room here. And you can get our brand new tote bags if you would like one. You can find out about joining the Free Speech Union. We've even got stickers that you can get, all that kind of thing. But we're a 4.5-year-old organisation that has grown to 20,000 members in that period, and 5,000 of those joined in the last 3 months since the government changed. So that might give you some kind of indication of the level of concern, which I think will probably be shared in this room. So today, this session, the purpose of it is to focus on a very particular aspect of our contemporary free speech issues, and that is academic freedom and freedom of speech on campus. So the question we're thinking about is academic freedom still under threat? And obviously the context is that there was a Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act that had been passed by the House of Parliament, but that was then kiboshed pretty swiftly when Bridget Phillipson became Education Secretary when Labour came into power. So we're talking about the state of education law and how that protects free speech on campus, and what needs to be done next, given that we thought we had some kind of a solution, and then that looks like it's not necessarily going to be something we can rely upon. So what we can do next? We've got an excellent panel, so I do encourage you to take advantage of their expertise when it comes to your questions and contributions afterwards, to really ask the questions that you want to ask, and try and focus down on who you might like to answer them. That would be all, for the good, I think. So starting here on my right is Akua Reindorf, KC. Akua is a barrister, a commissioner of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. She's an employment judge and a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics. She's taken a leading role in analysing and responding to many of the notorious cases of academic no-platformings and houndings. So she's extremely well placed to guide us through the legal questions of the law as it currently stands before we move on to understanding what the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act might have given us. And then we have Helen Joyce, who I'm sure will be familiar to a lot of you. Helen is the co-founder and director of the advocacy group Sex Matters. She's the author of Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality, and as such has been on the receiving end of a lot of behaviour that is very hostile to her free speech in particular, and free speech in general, both on campus and off it. Then we'll come to Michelle Shipworth. Michelle is an associate professor at the UCL Energy Institute at the University College London. There she teaches on her own module called Data Detectives, which is designed for master's students, teaching them to critically evaluate secondary data and factual claims. However, she was shut out of her own course by UCL management when a Chinese student complained about one of the examples she'd been using in her case for years. But she'll explain a lot more about that later on. And then we come to my colleague, Dr. Bryn Harris. Bryn is our Chief Legal Counsel at the Free Speech Union, which means that he directs decision-making in our legal cases and in our legislative work. He's been working on the FSU's application for judicial review to challenge the government's decision to throw the Higher Education and Freedom of Speech Act in the bin. So Bryn can talk us through our challenge to that and the importance of that act. And then we come to Graham Stringer MP at the end of the table. He's a Member of Parliament for Blackley and Middleton South in Greater Manchester. He's a member of the Science and Technology Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee, and has been vocal in the House and in the press in defence of academic freedom, and wrote a really excellent article in The Sun recently when the announcement was made that the Freedom of Speech Act was going to be dropped. So I'm going to come to each speaker and just ask them a question to kind of kick things off, really. So to start with Akua. Akua, I was going to ask you if you could explain the problem with the existing law when it comes to protecting academic freedom.
Yes, certainly, I will do. I'm sorry, everybody, to be here doing the very boring bit of law, but do stick around because Helen and Michelle will tell you the fun human stories. I don't know how much fun they were for them, but I'm just going to run you through the law. Before I do that, I have to say I'm here in my capacity as a barrister in independent practice and not in any other capacity. So, I mean, you'll all know, and I'm sure you're all here because the government has stopped commencement of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. on the basis, apparently, that it's a Tory hate speech charter, which is what I think probably a SPAD said to the press at some point over the summer. And one of the important things to know about that Act, which was passed by Parliament last year, is that it's not strictly speaking a consolidating Act, but it really does consolidate the existing law. It doesn't really go very much further than the existing law. And Bryn will later take you through the challenge to the pausing of the Act. What I'm going to do is talk to you about what the existing law is and try to convey to you just how complicated and messy it really is. And it's important to remember when thinking about what the current law is that this is what university administrators have to negotiate when they get a case internally about Israel and Palestine or about sex and gender, those are the two issues that just come up over and over again. And this law is just so messy and so complicated that really, as I hope you'll see, in a complex case, you basically just have to get a lawyer in, which is fine by me, but it doesn't work very well. Whereas the HEFSA, the new Act, would have tied it all up relatively nicely with guidance in a way which might have stood a chance of being more easily applied. So the law that the universities currently have to apply consists of several different strands. Academic freedom itself is not quite the same thing as freedom of speech. It's sort of related to freedom of speech, but it is a separate concept. It's a thing which sort of emerged around 100 years ago, maybe just over, as a distinct enforceable right in a way. It's a thing which is very much based on Enlightenment values. It's about academics having the freedom to sort of access some separate realm of objective truth and knowledge, sort of outside orthodoxy or politics or society. And it's important to have that sort of Enlightenment basis of it in mind when you're thinking about how it might be now a contested issue. And it's also important to remember that over time, it became something that was sort of claimed by the left. So in the 60s, at the LSE, the Council for Academic Freedom and Democracy was something that was founded by Ralph Miliband, for instance. And I think really like most speech-related or free speech-related ideas, it's something that's claimed at any given time by whoever feels that they're not in cultural ascendancy. That might be something that people want to think about for questions. But what it is, academic freedom, is really the freedom to pursue knowledge and truth without suffering adverse consequences in the academy. And it has boundaries to it. So, it's to do with not just your academic work, but speech and expression in and out of the academy, which is sort of has an element of scholarship, an academic element to it, is rigorous and so on. It doesn't have to be right, but it has to be, to a certain extent, respectable. It's not enshrined currently in any legislation that directly applies to universities, but it does indirectly apply to them because the Office for Students registration conditions, which are legislative, require universities to have in their founding documents and to apply in practice the concept of academic freedom. And they all have them they all have it in their constitutions. So it's something which they have sort of floating about, and that they know there's a sort of umbrella type requirement on them to observe, not that they necessarily do so. Another source for a type of academic freedom is in the Human Rights Act, which, as I'm sure you all know, incorporates the European Convention of Human Rights into domestic law. Now, what is in the Human Rights Act is freedom of speech, which, as I say, is a slightly different thing to academic freedom. It's a much wider concept, and it applies to universities in various ways. In some ways, when a university is acting as a public authority, so if it's putting on a speech for a seminar for the public or whatever, it's directly subject to the Human Rights Act. But in its relationships with its staff and students, those are private law relationships, so the Human Rights Act doesn't apply to them. But if staff or students wanted to bring a claim in a court or tribunal against the university under other domestic legislation, then that other domestic legislation would have to be interpreted in a way by the judge which is compliant with the Human Rights Act. So it has an indirect effect in that way. And freedom of speech under Article 10 of the Convention has a concept within it which is sometimes called freedom of academic speech or academic freedom of speech, which is, as I say, different to academic freedom, confusingly. It has its own legal framework, which I won't bore you with, but boundaries and exceptions. And like all free speech almost all free speech under the Convention, it can be subjected to restrictions and penalties if it's legal and proportionate for the authority or the university or whatever to do so. But for academic speech, the hurdle for those sorts of restrictions to be applied to it is much higher than it is for other types of speech. So that's another version of academic free speech or freedom or academic freedom. And yet another source is under the Equality Act. Recently, as most of you will know, Maya Forstater, who's here with us today, won her case in the Employment Appeal Tribunal, which established that gender-critical beliefs are protected beliefs for the purposes of the Equality Act. And there's been an explosion of cases where claimants have used the prohibition on discrimination because of protected philosophical beliefs as a way to enforce freedom of speech rights through the equality legislation, through the Equality Act. It's really, really complicated legally, or less so now, but it's not straightforward. And again, the Equality Act has to be interpreted in a way which is compliant with the Human Rights Act. So it's all becoming a bit circular. But essentially, this is actually the only way in which really an academic can enforce their academic freedom or free speech rights in any meaningful way is through the Human Rights Act isn't meaningfully enforceable, and neither are the academic freedom bits in constitutions. So this is the only realistically enforceable right, and it's complicated and it's very indirect. There's a right not to suffer discrimination because you hold a particular belief. It has significant drawbacks. It can't be used by visiting speakers. You have to hold the belief. Michelle will come on to explain how it let her down. To bring it all full circle, watch this space for an argument that a belief in academic freedom is itself a protected philosophical belief under the Equality Act, which is coming, as but I can't say very much more about that, but it is coming. So it's all very, very circular, very, very messy, and all has to be thought about under the umbrella of the Human Rights Act, and there are a number of countervailing rights that have to also be balanced, like the right not to suffer harassment under the Equality Act, Protection from Harassment Act, a whole slew of criminal restrictions on speech, all of these things which have to be taken into account by administrators when they're trying to think about how to resolve an issue of the sort that we're here to discuss today, and all of which involve value judgments or a knowledge of a particular, abstruse set of facts or things which people feel very, very strongly about. So if you're an HR professional in a university and you get in a complaint about an activist who's a pro-Palestinian activist where people on both sides are deeply, deeply knowledgeable about the war, then you really are, and you've got to apply all of this law and know about the subject matter, you're just lost. It's almost impossible to navigate your way through it. And the same for the sex and gender debate. People who are involved in it know every last detail. And universities are just, it's uniquely a difficult area, freedom of speech. So what HEFSA, the new act, was meant to do was to wrap this all up. Sadly, it's on hold, it's on ice, and we will have to wait and see what happens with it. And hopefully Bryn will give us all hope that it's coming back. I use my time.
That's what we always say, yes.
Okay.
Bryn, the source of hope. And Helen, moving on to you. So your experience, who's seen the videos or heard about Helen's story at Cambridge? Hands up.
Oh dear, because I was intending to tell it.
Yes, but there'll be more. There'll be more detail that they don't know. I wasn't doing that to catch you up. It was more to try and get a sense of whether he needs to. So the thing I thought would be helpful if you explain to us is the kind of limitations of the current law when it comes to letting staff know how they ought to be behaving, and also how students need to know and understand the rules of the university.
Sure. So a bit more than 2 years ago, I was asked by a professor of philosophy at Cambridge called Arif Ahmed, who went on to become the first director of free speech, who was going to be the person who was overseeing HEFSA, if I would come and talk at his college Keys in Cambridge, and we would talk about, the fact that there are two sexes and that something matters, which apparently is the nearest you can get to being a Nazi in modern day Britain. And what happened was that the senior staff at the college decided that they didn't like the look of this at all, and they sent out an all staff and all students email. This is a quote from it: "Freedom of expression is a fundamental principle which we wholeheartedly support. Individuals should be able to speak freely within the law. Views should then be challenged by debate, key in academic freedom. This is the case no matter the subject or topic." Claire Fox could have said this morning, couldn't she? The next word, however. On some issues which affect our community, we cannot stay neutral. We do not condone or endorse views that Helen Joyce has expressed on transgender people, which we consider offensive, insulting, and hateful. We have worked hard, blah, 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 diverse, inclusive, and welcoming. I really felt very welcomed and included. We feel that events such as this do not contribute to this aim. So they refused to let Arif use the college network, the email network, to publicise the event. And I mean, literally thousands of times a year, academics at Cambridge, Oxford, other universities, tens of thousands across the country, will just book a room. There's no fee. You just book it. There's a system. You send out an email. You tell people to turn up and hear about, gene expression in woodlice or something like that. And 6 people turn up or whatever, and you do your thing. So it was just meant to be like that. And then 24 hours before the talk, they said that it had to be ticketed. So, of course, immediately the tickets got booked up by people who didn't want anyone to hear me. We had to book another overflow room. I had to turn up 3 hours beforehand. Students turned up early because they were telling Arif they were afraid to be seen going in, and they were smuggled in the back. And in fact, a lot of the seats were empty, and the people in the overflow room took them instead. And then during the talk, there was a big protest outside. They've got a bit smarter recently, but I walked through the protest myself to get there, and nobody said anything, so they obviously hadn't done their research. But they did come in. Some of them broke away and came into the college and managed to get in around the back, and they started banging on the doors while I was speaking, and I was very determined not to stop. So there's a recording, I think it's back up on YouTube now, of the event, and you can't hear this because we were mic'd up, so it was on a lapel mic. But actually, I couldn't hear myself speak. But I was really very determined to keep speaking. I really don't know what I was saying. There was about 5 minutes when I just kept, it was as if I was talking out to a speech in American Congress or something. I wrote an open letter to them before the event and said, do come, tell me what it is I said that was so bad, turn up and say so. Never got an answer. And they continue. They continue doing this. They continue to defame me 2 years later. So in 3 recent issues of Varsity, which is the university magazine for Cambridge, the outgoing master of the college, Pippa, they were called Pips and Andrew, the pair of them. So babyish, like a pair of, nasty little CBeebies presenters. In 3 issues in a row, they got in that I was transphobic. So anyway, the point is that I had no recourse. So the Higher Education Act of 1986 says that universities must take reasonably practicable steps to secure free speech. But if they don't, there's nothing I could do. And I was a visiting speaker, so I couldn't use the Equality Act as an employee or anything like that. It's not my academic freedom, it's my free speech. And so what I learned really from this, and talking about it afterwards, is, most people don't actually care about free speech. I mean, Aqua said why. People only care about it when it's them that's being silenced, and most people think that they're not going to be silenced. They think that I must be saying something really awful. They work backwards from the fact that people are trying to stop me from speaking to conclude that I must be saying something very bad. So a left-wing friend of mine tells me that the word association in her circles with free speech is racism. they think that the only reason you want free speech is so you can say the N-word. So, I think, I don't know if Greg Lukianov is here or if it's his organisation that's here.
I think he's speaking.
I think he's speaking brilliant, yeah. So he calls free speech the eternally radical idea, which I love, and you need to remake the case for it to every generation. Because always powerful people really don't like it, and they think it'll be easier to silence their opponents. And I think it's very telling that the left has fallen out of love with free speech, because it used to be the left that argued for it. The ACLU wanted free speech, the Black Liberation Movement wanted free speech, gay people wanted free speech when they were fighting against Section 28, and now all those people tell you that it's hateful. So now they're in the cultural ascendancy, is what I learned from that. Why do we need to do it? It's not just to protect underdogs or just not to, protect my feelings or whatever. It's because it stops us from erring, or at least makes us err less often. The things I've been trying to say for the last 5+ years include gender clinics are sterilising children, and by the way, a lot of autistic kids, and by the way, a lot of kids who are going to grow up gay. And then it's taken us years to get to the point of the Cass review. Well, if we'd been listened to a bit earlier, fewer children would have had their lives destroyed. So I was asked to say something about how we can persuade students that free speech matters and not to feel so threatened by it. I just think we can't talk about that cultural change until we have a protection for holding the bloody talks. There's no point in saying, come along, it's not so scary, if I can't actually get onto campus and speak. It's like we're not getting out of the starting blocks. Universities just have to back the event holders to the hilt. If they had said, oh, yeah, if you don't like the look of her, don't go. You don't have to listen. Stay home, like you do to 1,000 other talks every year in this university, I think they'd have got over it really quickly. I'm now feeling very, very, very unaccommodating on free speech. So, 5 years ago, I might have been persuaded to use people's preferred pronouns to be polite or nice to them. And now I feel that, we are so close to not being able to say things that are totally ordinary and reasonable that we actually have to start saying them very deliberately. So I'm now going to go out of my way to say things that people don't want me to say. If we want to hold on to our free speech, I think a lot of us are going to have to do that at this point. You can live in Snitchville if you want, or we can actually start saying things like men can't be women, and I'm not going to call any of them, not even the nice ones, women. That's my one. You can choose your own one.
Thank you, Helen. I forgot to ask you your pronouns. And then we're going to move on to Michelle. So, Michelle, I was going to ask you if you could in your case, it's a very different set of pressures and complainants. So, and the issues are different. So if you could explain through illustrating your case, what other things people have to factor in when they're thinking about academic freedom, that would be very helpful.
Super, thank you. So this time last year, I was sitting approximately where Thomas is right now. I asked a question that reflected my bafflement at a student complaint and my head of department urging staff to be mindful of geopolitical sensitivities all of a sudden. Days before battle, at the start of my class, I asked, why does China have so many slaves? And I shared a world map from the 2014 Global Slavery Index, which coloured China medium-low for the level of slavery, but it rated it number 2 in the world. I'd used the same teaching exercise for 10 years without any complaint. It was part of the Data Detectives Master's module. Usually in all of the lectures, I pointed out the problems with the factual claims that I'd put up. But that week, the students quickly realised that it was their job. The class demolished the claim over the course of the hour. Only then, at the very end of the class, did a Chinese student complain about the initial phrasing. I was really puzzled by this. I've spent the last year being very puzzled, really, and confused. I explained that I was trying to motivate students to disprove the claim. Days later, my head of department urged staff to be aware of geopolitical sensitivities. Then I came to battle, I asked my question, and Ben from the Free Speech Union gave me his card. He was like a guardian angel, and I did not expect to need the card. After battle, I was told that one student had complained, then that I was told that several students had complained, then I was locked out of my online teaching platform and told to submit my emails for vetting, even though I've been communicating with international students for over 30 years. With FSU, without anyone ever editing them. With FSU's help, I regained my teaching rights, but colleagues insisted that I drop the exercise for future years, and despite there was really good evidence that it actually helped the students to learn. Months later, senior UCL colleagues, the very senior colleagues, actually agreed with me that my academic freedom had been curtailed. I told my departmental colleagues this. 2 days later, departmental colleagues claimed that my 10-year-old teaching exercise was evidence of my bias against Chinese students. My head of department investigated, found no evidence that I was biased, but took my master's module off me anyway, saying that we needed to retain a good reputation among future Chinese applicants and in order to remain commercially viable because we're so reliant on Chinese students. The Telegraph then put my story on the front page. UCL investigated, and at the end of a very long number of months, finally agreed that my academic freedom had been curtailed. But I've not been given my master's module back, and now no students on that master's module, or indeed any other master's course that I'm aware of at UCL, no students are learning how to be data detectives. Current law, so the current law on academic freedom doesn't offer me any redress, and there's no current law that can protect me. So the law on academic freedom has got, as Akwa's outlined, no practical enforcement mechanisms, and the Equality Act doesn't help me because I wasn't expressing a protected belief. At the time of the class, I did not believe that there were very many slaves in China either. I now know better. Exactly. It's opened my eyes to what's going on in China. So only after going public, because I wasn't paying attention to the China topic at all previously, after going public, I found reports about how the Chinese Communist Party infiltrates and influences universities. So government, security and foreign affairs offices and committees in the UK, in the US and in Australia, and major international human rights organisations have all reported that the Chinese government uses Chinese student groups and language institutes to be the eyes and ears and the enforcers on campus. Chinese students they're recruited to oppose any event or expression of views that the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, might not like. And the CCP now expects the core purpose of education in China to be furthering CCP goals, and it opposes investigative journalism, and official statistics are very widely distrusted. So I now wonder, and the CCP is pushing this narrative for abroad as well. So I now wonder if CCP supporters in my classroom objected to any kind of teaching of the critical evaluation of factual claims and secondary data, and were simply looking for an opportunity to stop that being taught in classrooms at all. I need to emphasize that most of our Chinese students are just here to study. And they are the ones very often most at risk because they never know who of their peers might report them to the embassy for saying something that the CCP might disapprove of. And that would put them and their families in very real danger. But anyone who then stands up to this, someone like me who stands up to this, is inevitably accused of racism or threatened with a reduction in Chinese student numbers from the embassies, for instance. The reports that I had read, so these are government reports, Human Rights Watch reports, etc., they were all in agreement that to combat these pressures, universities had to ensure academic freedom, i.e. they had to actually take steps to ensure academic freedom. And universities like mine have dismally failed to do this. And the only bright spot that was on the horizon at the time that all of this was kicking off was the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. And then, of course, the Education Secretary decided that she wasn't going to implement it. And this act is actually really vital, not just for the likes of me, but I think it's far more importantly, it's for our Chinese students so they can safely open their mouths in class as well, and for the value of a British degree so that we can teach critical thinking in our classrooms.
Thanks very much, Michelle. So if Bryn can now explain how the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act might have helped in some of these instances and what it is that the FSU is doing to try to rectify the situation.
Thank you, Jan. So it's my task to inspire hope, which is a pretty tall order. I'm going to start with what's going on with the campaign or the legal action to get the Higher Education Act, or HEFSA, reinstated. So just by way of background, as I'm sure many of you know, the Act was passed by Parliament and enacted in 2023. In April of this year, the ministers of the previous government commenced it, which is to say a sort of an executive ministerial act, commence it. And then, as we all know, Bridget Phillipson, in one of her first acts, revoked that commencement. First of all, we should be clear that we're not talking about, at least at this stage, we're not talking about repeal of the Act. It's very common for Parliament to say in a commencement section, once this Act has been passed, a minister will have discretion to say when it comes into force. Now, this doesn't mean, obviously, and I think even the slightest grasp of the UK Constitution would tell us, this doesn't mean, therefore, that Parliament is enacting legislation and then saying, over to you, Minister, do you want this to be the law or not? There's an expectation that when Parliament enacts legislation, that it will be enacted. There are, however, some circumstances where the Minister needs that discretion. So let's say Parliament has legislated for something rather expensive and then there's a financial crisis. The courts may well say, well, okay, it was appropriate for the Minister to say that enactment now is not appropriate, perhaps even impossible, due to a change of circumstances. We say no such conditions applied in the case of the revocation of HEFSA. Bridget Phillipson came up with a number of explanations and expressed in a wide array of wording, which suggesting she was acting on the hoof and perhaps not in the most thoughtful way. But she said, in particular, that the protection of, or enhanced protections of free speech would lead anxious universities to err in favor of securing speech, and that would mean particularly securing anti-Semitic speech or Holocaust denial. And following the 7th of October and the very real increase in anti-Semitism, that was an unacceptable change of circumstance. I won't go too much into the details. The problem, however, is what the minister is saying is that she doesn't like the policy that Parliament chose. And she's going to use her power to say, I want the law to be something else. Now that's out with the power that a minister has, because the government doesn't make law in this country. It is Parliament. So those are the grounds. Aside from the obvious reasons why I think, and many of us here think this is important, there is, which is to say, it is incredibly important to secure freedom of speech in higher education. There is, of course, a constitutional point here. Essentially what happened is a new government with a lot of legislation to get through, didn't have much time in Parliament, or this is my suspicion, Graham might be better informed, maybe will be better informed, didn't have much time, didn't want to devote time to putting a repeal bill through Parliament, and so looked for a way round that they could do it through ministerial power instead. That is essentially an attempt to get around or even subvert the proper power of Parliament to determine what the law is. Just very briefly on where we are, the Free Speech Union now has permission to bring a judicial review. That is to say, the court has assessed our claim and decided that it is arguable, which we were pretty sure of. There is an expedited timetable, because the High Court accepts that this is important and needs to be determined quickly. The government's therefore under an expedited timetable to give its defence. What we've seen of its case so far is unpersuasive and does not answer our claim. And we think that a hearing will be somewhere around the middle of January. It should be said that although it is a legal dispute at the moment, we think it's likely that the government will seek to essentially preempt and knock on the head this judicial review by making a political decision that makes it moot and academic, which is to say, the government will either repeal the act entirely, and we can't challenge that because it's an act of Parliament, or it will decide to part commence, which is to say, strip it down a bit, prune out one or two of the provisions that triggered some people, and see if that satisfies us. What I think we need to do is to make repeal the painful option, to make it the awkward, messy, neuralgic thing that would involve embarrassing parliamentary debates. There was already an urgent question in both houses recently, in which certainly the Minister in the Commons didn't fare well. Some of you may have seen that Rishi Sunak asked Keir Starmer at PMQs and got a slightly flat-footed response. So there are some issues here, particularly the China angle, that it's embarrassing and it's difficult. And what we want is for this to be continuously difficult, such that the government will not want to bring this into Parliament and invite repeated and renewed criticism of what they've done. It's also fair to say that the entire purpose of this revocation was because they didn't want to take it through Parliament. They didn't want to devote time to a repeal bill. If they now have to do that because Phillipson made a complete hash of it, which is what has happened, I don't think that will make them any more disposed to taking it through Parliament. So I think that is where we are. I think there are options if we don't get anywhere. Let's say there is repeal. I don't think that's the end of the story. I won't go into it now, but Akua mentioned consolidation. I think there's much more we can do, even with existing law, to consolidate it, to bring it together, to bring together domestic and convention law. So nil desperandum. I think whatever happens, we will continue to fight. And I think the stronger arguments are on our side.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bryn. You can always rely on Bryn to bring a bit of Latin into proceedings.
Raise the tone.
Graham, so from your perspective, from inside Parliament, could you just enlighten us as to what the thinking is, or what lack of thinking there might be going on here?
I can tell you what's been said.
Okay.
Thinking's a more difficult question in that. Just let me say, I just looked through the agenda. I'm the only Member of Parliament on the agenda today, and Richard Tice is speaking tomorrow. We are the only two people coming into the building, as far as I know, who have an absolute right to freedom of speech in the House of Commons. It's a privilege that was granted in 1689 because the people who were setting up a brand new constitution for the country then recognised you can't have democracy without freedom of speech. And so in that sense, MPs understand the importance of that privilege. It doesn't seem to have worked its way through necessarily to the response of my government, I'm a Labour MP, to the implementation of the higher education freedom of speech. Act. In preparation for this meeting, I went through the second reading of that bill. I took part in the statement that Catherine McGinnell made about why the Act wasn't being implemented, and I intend to tell you what was said. But there is a sort of bad smell, really, at the beginning of this process. You can always tell if ministers are up to no good. Most ministers like the platform of coming into the House of Commons and making a statement. If a statement is sneaked out in written form on a Thursday afternoon, with no publicity, then there is dirty work at the crossroads, really. And that's what happened to the, that was what happened to the statement saying that this wasn't going to be implemented. It's got all the hallmarks of something the government know to be a bad decision. The other telling thing is that a junior minister was sent along and not the Secretary of State when there was an urgent question. I made 2 points in that, which I will start with. One, we've just been elected as a Labour government with a manifesto that mentioned extending freedom of speech to some of the elected assemblies in the country. But there was no mention of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. Again, taking a decision not to implement an act fully when you've just had the ability to tell the country what you're going to do, I think smells a bit, and I explained that I would withdraw my support on that basis alone. The second question, what Catherine said when she was making the statement, was one of the major reasons for not implementing it was that there was too much burden on universities. Now, let me recognise to start with that many of our universities are pretty close to bankruptcy at the present time, and how they're surviving is on overseas students, particularly from the Middle East and China. And I have no doubt that there has been pressure from the universities to say we cannot afford to lose our Chinese students or our Middle East students, and they actually don't like the things that we've just heard now. And how Catherine in response said no, she didn't believe that was the case. How, when we've had at least 6 secret Chinese police stations in this country that students have been reporting to and telling those police stations what other students have been up to and what lecturers have been up to, how a Labour minister can say that this was not a consideration. It clearly was a consideration in many ways. Maybe it was the biggest consideration. But the other reasons given was, one, it was not a big issue. There are only 7 cases where speakers have been stopped speaking. Might have been 9 in this country. But that doesn't take into account the importance of those people who have, like Catherine Stock and others, who have lost their jobs and not been allowed to put their case forward. And those cases where people have just shut up, there has been self-denial of saying things that they think would get them into trouble. So that clearly is a major issue, but that's not what the minister was saying. The most bizarre reason, it wasn't given by a minister, it was given by a Labour MP in the second reading debate, Ribeiro Addy, gave this as a reason that, well, if we did this, we might have to engage in debate with those people who don't believe women should have equal rights. much of the last 100 years of debate, political debate in this country from the time of the suffragettes has been about debating with people who didn't believe that women should have equal rights and actually progressing that. It's the most bizarre reason that I have heard. I will sort of bring my conclusions, my points to a fairly quick conclusion, just by pointing out that while freedom of speech is important in its own right, in order that you can correct people, or you can have your own views corrected, you can have the clash of ideas, you can correct other views. It's not just an academic issue in universities about debate. It has real-world consequences, as the Cass report showed. Children were damaged over many years because of the pressure from people not to explain what evidence there was, or to challenge how little evidence there was, which Cass pointed out. And finally, my own experience during the lockdowns on COVID, where I upset the whips quite a lot by pointing out some of the misinterpretation, I think, of the science on COVID and the ill-thought-out consequences of the lockdown itself. The fact that there were not scientific red teams challenging the science, the fact that, again, my party wanted more of many of the bad decisions, and I would estimate that led to a waste of expenditure, not counting the impacts on the country's economy of between 200 and 300 billion pounds. I think Rachel would be rather glad of some of that 200 to 300 billion pounds as she sits down to do the budget now. So there are real-world consequences of stopping people speaking, stopping people challenging ideas, and eventually, and I'll finish on this point because I think I'm obscuring a quote from George Orwell behind me, but there's another quote which I didn't know that quote was going to be there, and I may be misremembering this quote from 1984, but it boiled down to the fact that freedom of speech, freedom means having the right to tell people that 2 and 2 equals 4, not if the establishment tells you 2 and 2 equals 5. It means the right to tell the truth effectively, and without that you don't have democracies, and universities can't function in the way that they were meant to.
Thank you very much, panel. Something just that occurred to me that that people might like to think about is just that what comes across actually is that the avoidance of Parliament and of democratic process suggests that the government does actually perceive that academic freedom and freedom of speech does have legitimacy in the wider populace, actually, and it does resonate with people, and therefore you can't have an open debate about it. So everybody says they're in favour of academic freedom and in favour of free speech. However, but there's always a but. And so it's I think it's kind of interesting, and maybe that is one of the sources of hope, that actually there is still quite a widespread recognition that free speech is essential to truth seeking. But maybe you can give us examples of where you think that no longer stands. Okay, so let's go out and if we can have questions directed at particular panellists, that would really help us to start with, I think, because you might as well make the most of them. So where's the microphone? So you've got a microphone and you've got, okay, brilliant. So you might as well give it to the chap there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm David Payton. I work at University of Nottingham. We're the institution that has a trigger warning that Chaucer might have expressions of Christianity given out to students. We're also the university that a few years ago tried to kick out a student midwife for expressing views that were pro-life. I've been in a debate recently about our dignity policy. One of the things in there says that it could potentially be a disciplinary offence if you refuse to use the correct, in other words, the person's pronouns. So not choose to avoid to use them if you refuse to use them. And I queried whether this was consistent with Equality Act belief on, religious beliefs or other beliefs, and was told, well, case law establishes that could indeed be a disciplinary offence. And so they were rewriting the policy, and they said, well, that part is going to stay. We have to be cautious. That's what the lawyers are telling us. So I wonder if perhaps Akua could comment on whether that is indeed the case, but also maybe whether would the Freedom of Speech Act have actually helped in that regard if it was passed?
Thank you. Yeah, and then if maybe Bryn and Akua could also answer whether it would actually protect academics' control over the curriculum. So the case of Chaucer, say there was an academic who didn't want a trigger warning on their Chaucerian module, would that help?
Okay, well, I'm going to deal with the pronouns issue first because I'm so happy to have a big audience to make this point to. This is one of the most egregious pieces of misinformation about the outcome of Maya Forstater's case in the EAT, where in the Employment Appeal Tribunal, where the Employment Appeal Tribunal said, when they said that Maya had a gender-critical belief that was protected, and so she doesn't have to believe in, not only that she doesn't have to believe in gender identity theory, but also that she can believe in gender-critical ideas. They also said, very much as an aside, this doesn't mean that you can go around your workplace misgendering people at will. It means, but all they meant by this was it might, in some circumstances, depending on the facts, amount to harassment. Misgendering might, in some circumstances, amount to harassment, totally depending on the facts of the individual case. What they did not say was that misgendering is harassment. But this is how it has been presented, relentlessly on social media. It is simply not the case. And whoever it was that gave you that piece of advice has taken it even further, another step further, which is just preposterous. I mean, you're moving towards compelled speech in that circumstance. So that's my bit of gratuitous legal advice for you. But on the question
of the disclaimer in any way or not?
Yeah, that's not legal advice. Sorry, don't rely on it, and don't sue me. On the question of whether HEFSA would have helped on the curriculum issue and whether or not it would have helped. I mean, the thing with HEFSA is that it really wouldn't have made any particular difference to what the substantive law is. And it still won't if it comes into force. There are some arguments amongst the sort of academic freedom community about precisely how far HEFSA goes, but these are at the margins kind of arguments, I think, anyway. If something is unlawful now, it would be unlawful under HEFSA. It's just that it's much harder to prove it under current law. I'm in two minds about whether that particular example of saying, an academic saying, I don't want to put a trigger warning on this, whether that would be something that's actionable. I'd have to have a closer think about it, but I would have thought certainly the current law would be something to look at in that context. Bryn may have some more thoughts.
It is interesting on the curriculum matter that it does involve essentially competing concepts of academic freedom. There's first of all the individual academic's right to teach according to their best knowledge and judgment, which certainly has a basis in the UNESCO recommendation of 1994, which also finds its way into some university statutes. So I think there is this principle that your freedom as an academic does entitle you to say, well, look, I'm not going to teach this curriculum because I I think it's nonsense. On the other hand, however, there is, of course, the institutional autonomy, the academic freedom of the institution, and that's the freedom of the faculty to get together and determine for themselves what they think the curriculum should be. Now, I don't really think HEFSA gave us any guidance on that. I'm not sure that it could have. We didn't think about this, and there wasn't any clear way in which black letter law could say what would happen here. My feeling is that it's likely that the individual's right in any legal dispute would weigh more heavily. However, I think there is a fair argument that if a faculty consults on its curriculum, if it allows full argument as to what it should be, there probably would at some point be a right to instruct that it be taught. There is also, I think, a question about when a curriculum is politicized, because I think that creates extra pressures. If the curriculum is, you have to teach this manuscript of Chaucer, not the other one, well, that's kind of, small beer. If they're asking their academics to fall into line with a political view, and the potential of ostracism or opprobrium if they don't, that really, really raises the stakes. And I think that is a different form of curriculum edict.
So is that the case of Al-Muqaddo would fit within that area, do you think?
Yes, and I think so. Al-Muqaddo is she was a permanently employed lecturer at the Open University, specialising in criminal law, and was dismissed after she raised repeated objections about sample cases that were being put to students, and which she felt gratuitously included examples of non-binary or transgender hypothetical people. And her point was, well, the reality of sex is important in the matter of sexual offences. So that's certainly on its face. I mean, it's to go before the tribunal. There are some things that make that a strong academic freedom case. Somebody speaking within the core of their expertise, engaging in debate with other academics about what the curriculum should be. So I think that to answer your question, Jan, is a very strong example of where academic free expression should probably be protected at its highest extent.
Okay, thank you. Helen, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say that, this law, it's simultaneously being described as absolutely enormous, like it's going to bankrupt universities and, allow Holocaust denial on campus. And at the same time, people are telling you it doesn't change what academic freedom or free speech on campus are at all. It just gives you an enforcement mechanism. And I think that, obviously the latter is true. That's correct, legally. What's going on is that vice chancellors are like all bosses. Why would they want a new regulation? They don't even need to know what the regulation is to say they don't want it. So they just don't want to have to engage with this. They want to have impunity because everybody wants impunity when it's them. It's that simple.
Sorry, Jen, I want to respond to that as well, if I may. The difficulty with that position, and I agree with what Helen said, is that I think what perhaps they're not appreciating is that they have the choice between an incredibly messy legal landscape, as I described to you earlier, and having to navigate that and having to pay expensive lawyers every time they have an issue, and having it all bundled up into a nice package with a bow on it, with a free complaints process operated by the Office for Students. They don't seem to understand the point that this is not new law, it's not new regulation, it's easier than what we currently have. For them, it's easier, and for everyone.
Thank you. Right. Have you got your hand up because you want to speak as well? You go first, and then we'll go to the back of the room. Yeah.
Well, I've got two questions. One's towards Graham, which is how can we fundamentally trust bodies like universities to maintain and keep academic freedom when they are fundamentally entirely at the whim of market forces. They have to appeal towards young students, and that's to seem as, though I don't like the phrase, as woke as possible, or as appealing to international students, which, as we've already talked about because of the cap on student finances that they so heavily require. So I'll put that to you. Helen, I personally am from the University of Exeter. I've been a member of the Debating Society there, Exeter Debating Society, for about 5 years now. I can only speak from a student point of view. But I do resonate your views slightly with that, which is that there is no appetite among students, among university students, on any campus I've ever met or outside of these specific circles of which we clandestinely meet. But how are we to inspire a new generation to have any level of commitment to free speech when there are such predominant orthodoxies at play, one might even say quasi-religious orthodoxies, which speak so heavily against the heretics that would claim against it? How are we supposed to be able to have that?
Okay,
final...
no,
go on.
no. Right,
You got it.
now you can do your job. Thank you. Excellent questions, thank you. Yes, towards the back, the chap with his hand up. Further back, yeah, thank you.
Well, I'll be brief because it follows on quite nicely from that last question. What I'm interested in is what is the role of the law when universities are in the business of actually setting up moral norms and cultural expectations of students and staff, and where they sometimes can say or imply, yes, you are free to say that, but some forms of thought are implicitly or explicitly affirmed, celebrated, associated with the university, and others are not. So, for example, some universities are very much in the business now of big values declarations, and very often at the top of the list is compassion. I'm all for compassion, it's a very important human virtue. But there's a line drawn from compassion to compassionate pedagogy, and there's a line drawn from there to decolonising the curriculum, safe spaces, and the use of pronouns. Our university, just very, very briefly, all of our students now are expected to take the Expect Respect module, which says if you are a kind and inclusive person, you will use pronouns. You don't have to. Nobody's going to make you do it. And just to reinforce the point, right next to it, there's a picture of a pride parade with a trans women are women banner. So nobody's saying you have to think that, but it's pretty much implied that you do.
Yeah, it's very clear what you're supposed to think. Right, okay, there's a chap here. No, further back, sorry, my pointing's not very accurate. That's it, thank you.
Okay, thanks. It was a great session.
Do you mind standing up?
Of course, yeah. Yes, thanks. It was a great session. We've heard a lot of about the problems in universities, but I do think you've got to be a bit careful with this, because the situation is very diverse in different faculties. Of course, there are serious problems, but there's a very big difference between the humanities and the arts faculties like English literature. Then you come to the faculties like economics and politics, the hard social sciences, where the situation's a bit better and different. And then you come to faculties like STEM, in which there's not that much talk about politics at all. So just a question that you've got to take.
Thanks, Thomas. Thank you. Okay, was there... Yes, there's somebody down the front row here. Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment kind of in reply to a previous comment. I think that there absolutely is an appetite for universities, physical universities, not online ones, which pride themselves on academic freedom and an open atmosphere of free exchange for students. I've stayed out of university when I've very much wanted to go into academia, perhaps for philosophy, for a number of years until recently, because I couldn't find a single place which didn't have a big diversity, equity, and inclusion statement other than, say, Jordan Peterson's recent online university, which unfortunately doesn't have a building. So I think that there's really a possibility for a groundswell movement of a kind of silent, tired middle of people like me who are aching to actually knuckle down and study hard in somewhere where you can have your ideas challenged, and that the cynicism that I hear a lot is premature.
Thank you. Well, certainly, so the Free Speech Union, we have a programme called the Ian McTaggart programme, whereby we fund student societies that are encouraging free speech and debate. So, and we have a lot of applications to that, and there does seem to be an appetite, including your society. So if people want to come and talk to us about that, then you can get information from our stall. So, okay, so just to round up some of those questions and bring them back to the panel, and then we'll come back out again. So the question of market forces, which was directed to you, Graham, and there. Well, we've done the no appetite for debate. If people want to pick up more on that, where it comes to where students are at. And then also the question from Jim Butcher at the back, who I know has his own Academic Freedom Society down at Canterbury Christchurch. How can we defend academic freedom when the purpose of the university has shifted away from truth-seeking to something more in line with sort of socialisation? Graham, did you want to start?
In my lifetime, I think universities have shifted from being just a public good into being marketised and a sort of market commodity. I mean, there has always been a debate, given the nature of subjects there are in universities, between whether people were going to university for the sake of learning, and the least important thing you got out of a university was the degree, which was probably the case in my undergraduate time. But we now, because universities are such big businesses and there is so much commercial and international pressure on them from outside funders, it is much more difficult to sustain that. And I think your question was in two parts. One was, how can you get students more concerned about that? I mean, that's always been a problem. I mean, it is partly what universities are there for. That's part of the nature of political debate. But if you have a market which is doing something that used to be done quite differently, then that is one of the cases for regulation, not just this act, which I think will remain. I think what's in the government's mind is to change it, maybe water it down, rather than go through the whole process of altering it. Of repealing it, which would take time and effort. Just one final point, which when I was doing the work for this debate, I came across a book which I read 50 years ago or more, called Warwick University Limited. And that was edited and written by E.P. Thompson, the famous historian. And there'd been a sit-in at Warwick where they discovered that Warwick University, which was new then, was keeping files on students and their political opinions. There was a huge reaction from students all over the country, sit-ins everywhere, and it did both change Warwick University and change a lot of other universities, the idea that students should have some say and they shouldn't be spied on, and there should be a more harmonious relationship between commerce and the students. That debate seems to have disappeared and been lost, and reinstigating that debate might go somewhere to answering the question you ask.
Thank you. And Michelle, did you want to say something about partly about the market forces, which you really addressed, I think, but also about the variety across different types of different areas of academia, whether STEM subjects, social sciences versus sciences are very different and subject to different pressures?
Sure. What I actually wanted to address is the question that suggested that there's very little appetite amongst the student body for academic freedom, and I would say that there's kind of pushes and pulls in that. I've got one story that's rather gloomy and one story that's rather more positive. The rather gloomy story was, in the second week of the module that I've just been speaking about. In the second week of that, I explicitly set it up so that they were going to be having a debate. That whole week was going to be about a debate, and they were going to be debating something that they had known nothing about 2 minutes earlier, cared nothing about. It was going to be, is Jeremy Bentham the heart of UCL? Which you would expect would be almost a nothing debate. And I set them all up sort of in groups. So you develop your argument saying, yes, he is the heart of UCL. And you develop your argument saying, no, he's not the heart of UCL. And now we'll have a few from each come up to the front and you have a debate. And I got the first person to say, right, he is the heart of UCL, and give your argument. And then I said to the next person, the very next person, I said, right, now disagree with him. Go on, disagree with what he just said. And he said, no, I can't disagree with him. I can't disagree with him. I agree with everything. I said, but you've developed your argument to say, no, he's not the heart of UCL. He said, well, yes, I have, but I can't disagree with him. I go, come on, it's going to be fun. so that's sort of alerted, and these are master students. I couldn't believe that they just couldn't open their mouths to say, well, I disagree with him, even though that he would have known that he didn't really disagree with him. But then on the other hand, in term 2, I got very much more explicit and said in advance, I'm going to have a debate. Not only are you going to be debating in class, but we're going to have some people come in and they're going to have a debate up the front. And the class got really excited by this over subsequent weeks, and they really started to open up. And 1 week I was thrilled to come in and find that they were having a very heated debate over, I think it was whether fat chips are chips or whether crisps are chips. Or it was something, again, equally meaningless like the Jeremy Bentham, but it did give me hope. And they really got into it and were having debates as the weeks went on.
Surely he's the head of UCL. I don't want to argue, but...
I don't think his heart's there. Let's hope. Helen.
So I have something to say about the thing that it might be different faculties. I think the problem's much worse than that, which is the enormous, huge increase in administrative staff, which has been the big trend in universities in the last 20 years. The reason that it's become so much more expensive to run a university is the enormous infrastructure. And they run essentially a parallel curriculum now, which doesn't go through any development or any academic rigor or whatever. It's much worse in America, but it's getting that bad here. So these things that you have to go to, I forget whether you're, all be nice to each other and be kind, respect module or whatever it was called, that's being presented to all students with no development in a faculty manner, no thinking about the ideas behind it, whether they're rigorous, whether they're meaningful. That's where people talk about microaggressions, which are nonsense, and about the whole implicit bias training, which we know doesn't work. And so 100% of students are being put through that. And then all the signals and signs around it. Someone I know was telling me they turned up at university for the first time a few weeks ago and went along to register and get a key card for the entry to the campus and was asked, do you want a plain lanyard or a Progress Pride lanyard? Which is like saying, are you ordinary or are you special? Are you a bad person or are you a good person? He said, I'll have the ordinary one, thanks. We need a bit more of that. But so that to me is the huge problem, is this development of a parallel curriculum that is teaching unexamined nonsense ideas and without people actually in the faculties themselves necessarily even noticing.
Thank you. Right, let's go out again. Sorry. Go on then.
Sorry. Okay, I just want to respond to one or two of the points that have been made. On the market forces question, I think that's one of several factors which are creating problems for academic freedom, and others include the precarious employment in which many junior academics are in, which is a real enemy to bravery, and sometimes bravery is what's needed to speak up against the orthodoxy. So that insecurity and the low pay, and also accreditation schemes, which are run by, were particularly prevalent in higher education. So universities will badge their websites with, Stonewall Diversity Champion or whoever, Athena Swan and so on. And these schemes, it seems that Stonewall aren't actually running their Workplace Equality Index this year. Who knows if it'll be back, but these schemes do train universities and other employers on the law, and not always accurately. And they are single interest groups, usually lobbying groups even, and that can lead to a great deal of misrepresentation of what the law is, and a very heavy emphasis on inclusion, which is conceived of as the enemy of freedom of speech. So that's one thing. On the question that was raised about morality and values declarations, I'm not a fan of values declarations. I have to say they've been very fashionable recently, but what is encouraging is that a lot of universities in the US have now started to make declarations of institutional neutrality, which is really, really helpful, where the sort of top level of the admin declare that they won't be making those sorts of statements in support of this, that, or the other cause. So that's hopefully something which will develop further over here as well. It's because it's really the only way, I think, that a university can truly navigate these very choppy waters. And just finally, on attracting young people to believing in academic freedom, I mean, I agree with Graham. It's, it's the way of the world that young people aren't going to be necessarily particularly interested in this or indeed any other thing that doesn't affect their lives. They will come to it once it does affect their lives. But there is a particular problem with this generation, I think, or people perhaps 40 and under, in that the sort of homo-inspired ideological framework within which they have been taught, and I speak as somebody who went to Sussex and did nothing but read Foucault for 5 years, and that was a long time ago.
She's all right now.
Yeah, well, I've survived it, just about. Although I did two completely different subjects. I did history of art, and then I did social and political thought, and the two courses were indistinguishable from one another. They really were, and it was just Foucault all the way. And that was how many years ago? 30 years ago now. So yeah, but that particular framework of meaning really will always privilege sort of subjectively felt harms of marginalised people above any sense or concept of truth or objectivity. And so that is a particular blockage to, for this particular generation. As I said earlier, academic freedom comes from that sort of Enlightenment-inspired. There is a realm of truth and objectivity, which, if we're left alone to apply the scientific method, will reveal itself to us in all its glory. And that's just not part of the framework of meaning for a lot of people these days. But everything changes. In the end.
Let's go out for this will be the final round of questions, I'm afraid, and then we'll come back to the panel for their final remarks. I can see the particularly keen people. It's like being a university lecturer again. Right, the chap with although there was no keen students, the chap with the blue jumper. So the people on the left with the microphones, in the middle of the aisle. Mark, if you stand up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Helen touched upon the ideological background to this, and I'm wondering if you agree or disagree with me, that what we're seeing is the emergence of a sort of proto-totalitarian movement in our universities, because it's predicated on the idea that free speech is a zero-sum game. So if some groups have it, others do not. And so the logic of this is that the more you censor in a progressive kind of a way, then the more free the society becomes. And this, of course, has clearly fascistic implications. And I think we should say that, but a lot of people would say that's a rather shrill and over-dramatic way of characterising what is happening.
Thank you. Right, and then there's the person next to the person who's just spoken. Yeah.
Hi there. I've got a question for Graham, please. Do you think that a national ban of smartphones in classrooms would be infringing upon academic freedoms of students?
Okay, let's keep moving forward. So the next one along. Thank you.
Thank you. Just going back to pronouns, and this is for Aqua. You mentioned that after Maya's case, that we have the right to our beliefs and to not have to use pronouns. Does that change if somebody has a GRC?
Okay, we might park that one because it's not a specifically academic question, if you don't mind, so that we can stick to academic questions. Yes, the lady there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. I'm Heather McKee. I am the convener for student academics. Sorry. I'm Heather McKee. I'm the convener for student academics for academic freedom. So I know there's quite a few students in the room. Please do seek us out. We're upstairs in a stand. But what I want to say is really, I think there's a lot of students who do want to stand up for free speech and academic freedom. I think they are fearful of that at the moment. I think HEFSA would have helped that. One of the things I wanted to ask Bryn was around this idea of bringing in HEFSA and PART. And one of the bits that I'm quite worried about as a student is the duties on student unions and that being missed out.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, and then the chap here in the yellow shirt. If people can be quite speedy, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
We can get everybody in.
Yeah, I have a quotation here from George Orwell, who was writing in the 1940s, which seems very relevant to our situation. In our age, there is no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues, and politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia. Particularly on the left, political thought is a sort of masturbation fantasy, which the world of facts hardly matters.
Thank you. Okay, and if you just come to the chat right down the front, and then we'll come over this side, don't worry.
I suppose I'm just thinking on from what Heather of Students for Academic Freedom said. It's more about the notion that universities have many, many moving parts within them. And certainly my experience at the moment is of feeling them, flying in all sorts of different directions at once. The OU is a great example, actually. In one way, they're supporting certain things, the gender critical network, things like that. In other ways, it feels like they've learned nothing from, the Joe Phoenix case. And I suppose it goes back to what you said, Helen. And there's something about the battle between commercial and academic there. That's not the only way of seeing it, but I'm certainly experiencing this. We'll go for free speech, but then they're still doing things like, whatever that module's called, don't respect people that you don't like, or something like that,
Okay, thank you. Right, and then we'll just do a final sweep here. So I'm going to start, if you just go back and then move forward. So there's Denise in the pink cardigan. I am using people's names only because I meet so many people, so I know them. So I'm not going to pretend I don't know you.
Just really
Stand
short.
up, Denise.
Very short question. I work in the arts, and there are thousands of arts graduates every year, and there's no jobs in the arts. Are there too many students?
Yes. Okay, and then the lady in the floral dress. Thank you.
Jane Fenton from Dundee University in Scotland. My question's about the academics themselves and thinking about the work that Eric Kaufman did, for example. And although academics weren't for censorship, some of them were. And millennial academics were twice as for censorship of colleagues who had unpalatable views in their eyes, twice as likely. So I just feel really despondent that as old academics like me head out to retirement, that body of pro-censorship academics is only probably going to grow. I'd like to hear what the panel thought of that.
Okay, so if the panel want to just prepare their final remarks, you don't have to address all of these questions, obviously. Just, the chap in the check shirt. This guy here. Yeah, sorry, long way over.
During my time at university,
stand up. It's
sorry,
easy.
yes.
Great.
During my time at university, I knew a number of people who, within their first few months at arriving at the institution, were already joining the sorts of crowds who are banging on doors and trying to prevent people from speaking. To what extent is this a problem that starts a lot earlier than university that we need to address in schools?
Okay. Yep. And then finally, the chap on the front row here. It's coming. It's just behind you. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, is this push for, let's say, diversity shenanigans, is it coming from the students mostly or the teachers? Mm-hmm. And has the universities been about education in the past and now is like, what, making money or something, social programs or whatever? I never went to university just because of these things. It's just waste of money.
Thank you. Okay, right. I'm going to go along the panel in reverse order, actually, because it's a while since Graham's spoken. So, Graham, do you want to round us off first? Just
two or 3 points
so.
very quickly, I'll try. I've never really thought about mobile phones and children in terms of academic freedom. I've always thought about the issue in behavioural terms. I would have imagined that you could get the information elsewhere, so I don't really see that as a quick thought, as academic freedom. I think if you restrict freedom of speech, to answer Mark's question or to respond to Mark's question, and you have authority that can't be challenged, then you're on the road to totalitarianism, although I have much more faith in the people of this country and our institutions that we wouldn't go down that path. And I think the final point I would make, to tell an anecdote so much than the others, I campaigned to leave the EU, and I was given the short straw of going around our great universities where the audience, students and staff were 80, 90, 95% in favour of Remain. It was not an easy gig, but the surprising thing was I was involved in student politics when I was a student, and it was a pretty robust debate then. There was heckling and interventions and all sorts of things. I was only heckled once, and that was by a master of an Oxford college in a large debate in the Wills Hall in Bristol. But I didn't despair at that lack of thing, because I was doing a debate in King's Cambridge, and it was the same. Everybody was polite. There was no spontaneous criticism or heckling. But they had projected onto the back wall the tweets that they were making, and they were refreshingly rude and direct about what was being said. So beneath all this artificial politeness, there is real direct debate happening in students' minds.
And students are falling out about this in productive and non-productive ways, I can report. Bryn.
Three things very quickly. The academic from Dundee, didn't catch your name. You said how there's going to be a new generation of sort of millennial academics. They're not just going to become senior academics, they're also going to become judges, senior civil servants, senior police officers. And they do not come from a culture of open-mindedness, fairness, fair-mindedness. We shouldn't have a go at the young, but they are fundamentally unequal to the demands of liberal democracy, and it's absolutely terrifying. We do need to do something. Just quickly, there was a question about duties on students' unions. There is a question, okay, if HEFSA is trimmed, what is the fat that could be trimmed? It's a question that the FSU isn't agreed upon. I mean, I disagree with my boss. I don't think he's in the room at the moment. I think it's insane to put these duties on SUs. They're kids. Of course they do stupid stuff. There should be a duty on the university to keep their SU under some sort of control. But the idea of mirroring the duties and putting them on a bunch of kids on sabbatical, it's crazy. I don't think we should do that. The last thing is about equality, and I'll probably say something that some people might disagree with. You know, there's a lot of us bang on about EDI all the time, and it gets a bit tiresome. I think we've got to live with EDI. Most of the disputes that we see are fundamentally equality disputes. That is to say, universities have free speech. If you want to say the right thing, you can say it as vociferously, as controversially, as loudly as you like. They understand what free speech is. They just don't apply it equally. So if you've got the wrong views, you don't have freedom of speech. So we can't ditch the concept of equality because it's fundamental to what we're seeing. It's the equal application of the right to free speech we need to see. Diversity of ideas is always... So we've got to live with EDI. We've just got to criticise it in the right way.
Thanks, Bryn. Right, super quick, everybody now. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I'm just going to disagree with Bryn on the student union bit, simply because the Chinese Students and Scholars Associations, which sit within the student unions, are almost all directly controlled by the Chinese embassy. So we have a bit of a problem there. Totalitarian impulse is definitely to be seen amongst colleagues, which is rather alarming. And the more I read about the CCP, the more I'm worried about the increasing totalitarianism I'm seeing amongst my colleagues. And I just wanted to mention that there's a debate, that we're having another debate on the HFOSA, on the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, at City University. So if you wanted to Google Higher Education Freedom of Speech, City University. We're having a debate on the 30th of October, and Akua is going to be speaking at that as well. Thank you, Akua.
Very good. Helen?
I completely agree that there's too many higher education students, and that's not because I don't want young people to be qualified. It's because too many things that didn't need a degree have been stupidly made into things that do need degrees. So you've got plenty of young people who honestly just want to get to the job they want to do, and we force them to go through something quite pointless and badly run, and those people are quite disengaged, and they see it as just a hurdle that we've put them through, that they're going to get 50k of debt and so on, and these are not, this is all a pretense on every side. So that to me is the problem there, and you can't really talk about free speech very easily when large numbers of people basically kind of wish they weren't there, and you're putting them through a sausage machine. On the plus side, the circle always turns. Yes, young people are more censorious than they were, but the sort of tripe that's being taught in these compulsory modules is so boring that no normal human being can bear to sit through it for very long. And you start to hear that from them. They'll come out of it going that they never want to hear the word diversity again in their lives, which is a shame because diversity was great when we actually meant something by it. So that's my kind of hope, is that we're boring the pants off them to the extent that they will come out, with a bit of gumption to them.
I think they will.
Aqua.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, if my sons are anything to go by, they certainly will come out of it with some gumption. Very quick point. Student unions, yes, that is a new part of the Act, but eminently disposable, and I don't anticipate, the emphasis coming from government at the moment is that they're taking the time to get the legislation right, by which I think they mean either we're going to try and repeal it or we're going to get rid of bits of it, and the bit that'll be, I should think, the first thing to go. I tend to agree with Bryn about that. On the question of generational change, yeah, the wheels will turn. I certainly hope so. And somebody talked about that in the context also of marketisation. And I think, we talked earlier about market forces. It's not just market forces, it's actual marketisation of higher education, I think, has been a really serious contributing factor to the crisis we're now in. On a point that was made, I think, by Bryn a moment ago about we should stop moaning about EDI. I mean, I think that I firmly believe that freedom of speech and related matters are all part of one equality and human rights ecosystem. And it is part of equality and human, it's part of EDI. And there are bits of EDI and approaches to EDI which are problematic.
Okay.
Stop.
I'm so sorry to do that, but they're jumping around at the back. I did know that we were supposed to finish on time. Okay,
thank you. They were here for us.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Please exit. Thank our panel while clapping. And if you want to see Toby Young speak, he'll be on a panel tomorrow discussing the First Amendment and whether Britain should have one.